Good afternoon. I am honored to serve as a trustee on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library Foundation Board and have done so for over 20 years. So let me add my welcome to my former colleagues and our distinguished guests who are here with us today. In a CBS piece that aired the night of President Reagan's death, Leslie Stahl concluded, quote, "Ending the Cold War will certainly be how he is remembered most in history." If that was President Reagan's crowning foreign policy achievement, then peace through strength was his most important guiding philosophy. Peace through strength had its critics and it's created its share of controversy. But it just made sense when President Reagan explained it in his 1980 convention speech. Many of you were there. He said, "We know only too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong, but when they are weak. It is then that the tyrants are tempted." So we ask, what of peace through strength today? What of the Reagan legacy? Are we heeding his example, or are we coasting on his accomplishments? As a staff member on the National Security Council, I saw Reagan's philosophy in action in real time. What was the most impressive is how he often had to defy the critics and challenge conventional wisdom when it would have been far easier to do the opposite. But, as you remember, he refused to accept the status quo. Reagan had a vision for a stronger America in the world. You recall, he wanted the evil empire consigned to the ash heap of history. He got what he wanted and what the world needed. Secretary of State George Shultz observed years later, "I think in the sweep of history, you just have to say that his judgment was better by far than his critics' judgment." Secretary Shultz got it exactly right. So the question becomes, how would President Reagan judge us today? Well, I'll leave that question to our panel. Guy Benson of Fox News will moderate our next conversation. It is an honor to present former UN Ambassador and Reagan Arms Control Director Ken Adelman, who is also the author of Reagan at Reykjavik, 48 Hours That Ended the Cold War. My former colleague and friend, Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, who served as the Director of European and Soviet Affairs on the Reagan National Security Council. Professor William Inboden, now at the University of Florida, who is the author of The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. And K.T. McFarland, a veteran of multiple administrations, including Reagan's, and former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump White House. Please welcome them to the stage.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Go ahead, Sam. KT, you're there. Right there.
We have enough chairs.
We do.
Otherwise, it was going to be process of elimination.
We could play musical chairs. One of us has to stand. Well, good evening. What an honor it is to be here. This is incredible. It's like a pinch me moment. I feel like they've mistaken me with someone else to entrust me with this panel and try to facilitate the conversation. We have so much expertise and experience up here, which I lack, with the one exception of I am a Reagan baby. I was born during Ronald Reagan's second term, just after his second inaugural. And I was sort of nervous about this. I was talking with a friend, and she said, "Okay, so you were born in '85. Do you think maybe a key moment in your existence may have happened the night he won?" And I said, "Well, let me do the math." And I said, "No, it might have been the convention." Then I realized I didn't want to be thinking about that, so I moved on. And so let's do the same. I would like to begin, ladies first, Madam Ambassador, with you. Just sort of a broad question. Before he was elected, there was a caricature of Ronald Reagan when it came to what his foreign policy might be. And even post-presidency, there is a public image of the ambassador, you all good? Oh, we're gonna need some extra mics. Of the president. I wonder how you feel that caricature or that image compares with what he actually did as a practitioner of American foreign policy and a wielder of power.
Great. Well, first, let me say I'm really delighted and honored and thrilled to be here this early evening. And thanks to the Reagan Library, really just appreciate the invitation. And if you don't mind, Guy, my saying, I also feel like I was a Reagan baby, but of different sorts, because I actually was in my early 20s when I worked on and had the privilege of working on the National Security Council staff. It was a real honor for me. I was there for 7 years of the administration on the NSC. So to answer your question, you know, it's an important one because Reagan was underestimated. He was not only underestimated, but he was also maligned in certain quarters. I'll never forget looking at European press and so many articles, especially in Europe, but other places, but especially Europe, had characterized him, the cowboy is coming. What does he know? What is he going to do, the cowboy? He was underestimated, and in this sense, where did the practitioner come forward? I think he proved a number of things in rather record time. First, that, as you already did hear in the first panel, he was an outstanding communicator. He was someone who put forth ideas, and he not just only put forth ideas, but ideas that he acted on. He also had substance to him in the sense of a framework, a vision. He was indeed a visionary. He was consistent in being anti-communist. He was consistent in terms in foreign policy of speaking about the need to defend freedom, democracy. He also believed very fervently, and this was a key element relevant to your question, he was someone who believed fervently in collaborating with like minds and partners. And there, in the case of Europe, well, we know the story of his relationship with Margaret Thatcher, but I also want to put in the mix Helmut Kohl. Margaret Thatcher, definitely, but also Helmut Kohl. Chancellor Kohl was someone who he worked with, and so you had Thatcher, Kohl, Reagan, and of course we're going to hear this evening also with Prime Minister Mulroney in Canada. So how crucial it was that he had these partners that worked together, that were of like mind and felt it was important to go forward. I'll mention one last point here. One of the areas that I worked on at the time of the beginning of the Reagan administration, and so going to that point of where he was being challenged as to how he was going to handle tough issues, you had the imposition of martial law in Poland. And I'm mentioning this because I remember very distinctly, Reagan was very definitive, and when he made a decision, not only did he make a decision, but he stuck with it. And in this, he gave a speech that was one of the most emotional speeches I remember, and kudos to the speechwriters in this. It was how he appealed to all Americans and also to the globe at large, light a candle in the window, and we want freedom in Poland. Light a candle, and he appealed and appealed to all to do that. At the same time, he imposed economic sanctions. He also worked with the Pope and the Catholic Church in ensuring that humanitarian aid got through to those in need and who were deprived of assistance. He collaborated, of course, with tough-minded, the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, in this, as well as some other European leaders. And finally, he also ensured that Poland was punished in the sense that here it was, its most favored nation status was taken away, and also it wanted to become a member of the IMF, and those actions were taken against them, and sanctions were imposed against Russia. I think he showed his mettle right from the beginning, and it changed. It really changed, not only then, but also, as we've heard in the earlier panel, in terms of how he's measured. He's measured as one of the most popular presidents. His statements and speeches are reiterated, like peace through strength. So in that sense, as a practitioner, he was underestimated, but he's someone who has enduring policies.
And KT, part of the underestimation came from this idea, oh, well, he's just an actor. And he's, you know, he's handsome and he talks well, but he's not a serious person.
He's not a heavyweight.
And right. one of the areas of ridicule, frankly, was around his really grand vision of Star Wars It's science fiction. It can never happen. What is he doing? And I know that you want to address that part of it.
Okay, so here's the thing. There were, in the foreign policy, national security world, there were two sort of fundamental rules that everybody learned, and you never deviated from those. The first was that we had a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that was a whole lot better than a hot war. And that this Cold War would go on for infinity. We would never be able to, we either had a whole Cold War or a hot war, but nobody was ever gonna win this war because a hot war would have meant a nuclear war, and nobody wins a nuclear war. And no war means we would have conceded. Well, Reagan looked at that and says, I don't like either option. We don't like a hot war, we don't like a Cold War, and that's when Reagan said famously, my plan for the Cold War, we're gonna end it because we're gonna win and they're gonna lose. Well, the whole foreign policy world said, oh God, he just doesn't understand, he doesn't realize, he doesn't know how to do it. And so he then flipped it all on its head because peace through strength never meant what a lot of people thought, which was only military strength. For Reagan, peace through strength meant all aspects of national power and strength. So we've heard from the Art Laffer what peace through strength meant in the economic sense. We dominated the world economy. In addition to that, peace through strength meant a Reagan military buildup. And in addition to that, it meant that we would use our superior technological ability to really shut down technology to the Soviet Union. I mean, when Reagan came into office, in the Soviet Union, they didn't have Xerox machines. Xerox machines. I mean, they were using mimeograph machines or carbon paper. They didn't have even something as fundamental as a Xerox machine. What Reagan did was systematically go through to achieve the Cold War victory, where there were about 8 different steps that were taken. 1, shut down their access to American technology. 2, Reagan defense buildup. We can challenge them on the defense field and on the spending field. 3, shut them out of the international banking system. So the Soviet Union could never borrow money in the international banking system if they had to. The next plan was help our allies rebuild their military, particularly our European allies. And then when he had all the ducks in a row, 2 things happened. The Soviet Union had 2 back-to-back poor harvests. So they couldn't feed their people, they had to borrow, and they couldn't borrow in the international banking system. And so they were stuck. And then the final thing that made all the difference was the Star Wars speech. So the second rule in foreign policy, international security, besides you're gonna have this Cold War forever, the other rule was what was called mutually assured destruction, MAD. Now what that meant is we've got nukes, they've got nukes. How do you prevent a nuclear war? Well, you know that you can each have a gun, loaded gun to each other's heads. So if the Soviet Union were to attack the United States with nuclear weapons, even if there was not one American left, there would be enough nuclear weapons to then attack the Soviet Union, and vice versa. So you never start a war because you know that it's mutually assured destruction, MAD. Reagan didn't like that at all. So the final part of his we win, they lose was the proposal of the Star Wars system. So Star Wars at the time, there was President Reagan was approached by by Dr. Edward Teller, Nobel laureate, and with the idea that maybe technology had changed so that the United States could actually defend against nuclear weapons. We didn't have the technology, but President Reagan, working very quietly and very secretly with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the the American Science Advisor, and Dr. Teller, started coming up with a plan that maybe we could put a shield over the United States. We could defend against nuclear weapons. We could get away from MAD. So there was a speech Reagan was going to give in March of 1983, and it was part of the Reagan defense buildup. At that time, as the previous panel was saying, that there was a lot of interest in like cutting, we need to start raising taxes, we need to start cutting government spending, and Reagan wanted to really shore up the Reagan defense buildup. So he was going to give a speech from the Oval Office giving all the arguments of why you have to stay the course in the Reagan defense buildup. I wrote the first draft of the speech because in those days, if it was about technical stuff like military stuff, you'd have it come from the Pentagon. Well, Reagan, so I wrote a great speech that nobody remembers because the really great lines were written by Reagan himself. And he put 2 paragraphs in this speech where he challenged the scientific community to come up, long time, it might take a long time, but to come up with a way to defend against nuclear weapons. So there he kicked the foot out of the second main tenet of national security policy. He was going to destroy mutually assured destruction. So he gives the speech. I was privileged to be able to be in the Oval Office while he read the speech. After the speech, he had invited some scientists and military guys. There were about 40 of us. And everybody nobody kind of met each other. People had heard of each other. But they all started talking about, Reagan said, maybe we should think about this thing in the future, this Star Wars system. They weren't calling it Star Wars. But listening to the scientists talk to each other about, okay, what would we need to do this? Okay, there are probably 5 key technologies. We need robotics, we need laser capabilities, we need miniaturization, to maybe have a space launch system of zapping the red nukes. Anyway, the next morning, the New York Post had a headline. And anybody read the New York Post? You're all Californians, you probably don't even know what the New York Post is. Okay, the New York Post has fabulous headlines. You don't even have to read beyond the headlines. So the next day, after Reagan's Star Wars speech, which we were insisting that people should call Strategic Defense, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, the New York Post has Reagan's Star Wars plan to zap red nukes. And therefore, it was born that it would be called Star Wars, which to this dying day, Reagan never really liked. But what happened was that we didn't know how we were going to build this nuclear shield, this missile shield. We knew we would have these potential component parts, and we knew the Russians had better lasers, we had better satellites. But what happened was not what Reagan really anticipated. What happened was that the Soviet Union, now remember, 2 bad harvests, kind of no more money because they're spending everything on defense, can't borrow money, shut out of the technology. The Soviet Union, the Soviet leaders, and we didn't know this really until after the Soviet Union collapsed, but they said to each other, Jesus, we don't know if the Americans can do this, but we know we can't. And we are spending 20% of our budget on our defense. There's no way we have a nickel more to spend on a Star Wars system. So Reagan, by going against the conventional wisdom on mutually assured destruction and on the forever Cold War, was able to actually win the Cold War and change the world.
Ken, I think if you ask the average person on the street, quote Ronald Reagan with something that he said accurately, I think by far, the most prominent, prevalent answer would be, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. You've, of course, written the book on the relationship that they had in that key summit. What was it like really behind the scenes, those 2 world leaders, as Reagan was poised to actually win this Cold War, which people didn't think was possible, he knew different, and how does that play into his ultimate legacy?
Yes, and thank you, Guy. And it's wonderful to be back at the Reagan Library. And thank you, David, and thank you, Fred. Joe and Drake invited me here several times before, and I told I thought they were wonderful, stories about Ronald Reagan, and had just a good time. It was so meaningful because, as Pete Wilson knows, and Rick Burt and Paula know, our time in government was terribly, terribly exciting. You're in the spotlight, and all of a sudden you leave government, and you're no longer in the spotlight, and there's some legacy of, speaking of legacy, people coming up to you. 3 months after I left government, the day after Gorbachev left Washington, D.C. after signing the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. Someone came up to me 3 months later and says, boy, you look awfully familiar. And I was all proud, and I said, thank you. Yeah. She says, didn't you used to be somebody? And I said, yes, I was somebody. She says, I thought so. And so, you leave government, and, you served as well as you could. I want to do a little something different here, Guy, and I want to use a technique of Ronald Reagan and talk about his legacy. That's what this whole conference is about, his living legacy. And I want to do it using a tool because what he did in 19 83, he gave a speech, and it was cheapened to call it the Evil Empire speech, because the speech wasn't about the nature of the Soviet Union. He had given that speech before, he would give it again. That's not what was on his mind. What was on his mind in Florida with the evangelicals was about courage, and it was about moral clarification, okay? And his critical part was to beware the temptation of blithely declaring yourself above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong, good and evil. Okay? When you think back 40 years and think, what is the foreign policy issue since Ronald Reagan that is the defining issue of right and wrong, good and evil? It has got to be U.S. aid to Ukraine. Here is Russia invading Ukraine, now has destroyed over 50% of the power generation of Ukraine. The New York Times just did a study showing that if Manhattan was bombed the way cities in Ukraine have been bombed, it would have destroyed every building in Manhattan 5 times over. You saw in Bucha that people were lined up like the early years of the Holocaust, shot in the back of the head. Now you have hundreds of children taken from their families, sent to Russia, with changing their names, being raised by Russians as little Russians and kidnapped, absolutely. So you have the absolute clarity of the good and the evil. And what happens? Well, in February, over half the Republican senators vote against aid to Ukraine, including Lindsey Graham, who, as Pete worked with in the Senate, Lindsey Graham was the hawk of all hawks. He was McCain's best friend. He went around the world saying we're soft and soft, okay? He votes against aid to Ukraine. And how does he explain it? He gives a salad bowl of words that make no goddamn sense at all. Last month in the House of Representatives, you had the majority of people in the House of Representatives waving Ukrainian flags, and the majority of Republicans vote against aid to Ukraine. I'm just so glad that Ronald Reagan isn't around to see something like that, because this is the clearest issue since Lend-Lease in 1941 that kept Britain alive, basically, where the Nazis were taking over Eastern Europe. And why did this happen? It happened because peace through strength that all of us know and love just hasn't happened in the Republican Party. They've given up on the Republican Party. What's happened was Ronald Reagan, as Paula, you made very clear, he worked very closely with Kohl and with Thatcher and, with the parents of you guys who we're going to hear from later. And he loved the Western democracies. Donald Trump doesn't. He doesn't like the democracies. What he likes is he likes Putin. He likes Xi. He's very smart. Xi is very smart. When Putin took over some part of Ukraine in 2014, Trump said, well, that's very smart. He got all that territory. And he just took it. He's smart. And what did Trump say? He fell in love with Kim Jong-un from North Korea, the most barbaric and awful leader. Well, Ronald Reagan, and we've said it, and you said it, Guy, very nicely, Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And if I may put a plug in for my book, Reagan at Reykjavik, when Reagan was sitting there at Reykjavik with Gorbachev in a little room, he said these things right to Gorbachev's face. He said, you know what, I get opposition all the time. Well, they write about me, and I don't like it very much. But you know, when you get opposition, you send them to jail. He says that right there. And he says, you know, the difference between freedom and totalitarian. And he really put Gorbachev, and you can see the notes in my book, the notes, both the Russian notes and the American notes. You think, whoa, that is really something. But he just said it right up there. So you're right, Guy. His most notable comment is, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. To me, the most amazing comment from Donald Trump is, Russia can do what the hell it wants to NATO countries. I don't care. And he said that, okay? And it just hurts on the legacy of foreign policy that I think that if Trump, God forbid, gets elected again, I think NATO will be gone, to tell you the truth. And I don't think it has to be that we get out of NATO or diffuse NATO. It's not how things work. I think what would happen was that basically he would say and signal, and everybody would know, that he's not going to enforce Article 5. He's not going to do anything to protect NATO countries. You know, they can all, buzz off, and Russia can do whatever the hell they want on NATO countries. In foreign policy, in a way that, breaks my heart to see these things, you have a conclusion that John Lehman, who was really a powerhouse in the Reagan administration, served awfully well. And Pete, you must have worked with him because he was Secretary of the Navy, and you have so many Navy facilities around here. John Lehman wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, aside from Peggy's article, in which John Lehman's first sentence was, he's one of the very few foreign policy mavens of the Reagan administration that's still vertical. Well, thank you, John, but some of us are still vertical here. And the title of his article was, Reagan would never vote for Donald Trump. And his paragraph said, Donald Trump is no heir to Reagan's legacy. He is an insult to it. Okay. All right. I understand. I understand you don't like this, okay? But let's have Ronald Reagan's courage. Let's have the courage that Ronald Reagan advocated, that to see the difference between right and wrong. And if I'm telling you something, if I'm telling you something that's not true, tell me it's not true, okay? Did a majority of Senate Republicans vote for aid to Ukraine? Did that happen? Or that doesn't make any difference? Okay, that doesn't make any difference.
So points
okay.
made. I want to bring the professor.
Okay, fine.
Because
I got more to say.
I'm sure you do. So, Professor, we did hear in the last panel, and this is one of the critiques of the movement, of the conservative movement, away from Reaganism on the economic front. There is a push there. There are some people who will argue that the current, whatever you want to call it, Republican Party or conservative movement is abandoning or at least straying somewhat away from Reagan's peace through strength approach. I wonder what you make of that, and just the importance, the lasting importance of Reagan's legacy that's still with us and still with the Republican Party of today.
Thanks. Thank you, guys. So I think it's first important to appreciate Reagan in his own time, which is he was also part of a divided Republican Party that was primarily divided over foreign policy. Right? So these divisions that the GOP is going through today are, in that sense, nothing new. And this is where I'm picking up on what Katie and Paula and Ken had all said in different ways. I think I can draw these together. Through the 1970s, most of the Republican Party was embracing the Nixon-Kissinger Ford détente view, which is that the Soviet Union is a rival nation state to be contained and managed. Right? They didn't want to surrender. This was not really a policy of weakness. I don't want to be unfair to it, but they didn't envision the possibility of defeating the Soviets. Right? That was just inconceivable. The Soviet Union had always been there and was always going to be there. And Reagan, with his insurgent campaign in '76, then his victory in 1980, has a very different vision, not just from Nixon and Ford, but from every previous Cold War president, going back to Harry Truman, who had all seen the Soviet Union, again, as a rival to be managed and contained. And Reagan reverses that, and he has a very new theory of the case that he first brings the Republican Party around to, and then eventually he brings the rest of the country around to, but it was very controversial at the time. And that is that the Soviet Union is not fundamentally a rival nation to be managed and contained, it's a vile idea to be defeated. And so that's what he means by we win, they lose, which is that the United States and the free world can prevail and that the Soviet Union can be defeated. It can cease to exist because it was fundamentally a wrong idea. And as he reframed the Cold War as that battle of ideas, and that's where it brings in that moral clarity, which Ken was talking about. In hindsight, we can see that this was brilliant and it worked wonderfully. And I think he was fundamentally right. But we need to remember at the time, this was very controversial within his own party and especially with expert opinion. Most others thought this is inconceivable. The Soviet Union, we now know it had that sclerotic, broken economy. At the time, people knew it was kind of inefficient, but no one thought that it would actually collapse. At the time, the Soviets had the strongest military in the world, stronger than the American military, and it was, thought that we're in a state of permanent decline, and Reagan envisioned the possibility of rebuilding our military to be stronger than the Soviets, but not just numerically stronger, but smarter and more lethal than them as well. And so it took that fundamentally different theory of the case, and it took presidential leadership. And eventually the party came around to support him. Eventually public opinion did. But in his first few, certainly as a candidate in his first few years in office, he was a lonely voice in the wilderness there. And even, many of his own staff weren't sure about this new theory of the case. And so I think in that sense, it's a great case study, not just in strategic foreign policy leadership, but also how one can move and persuade public opinion and bring the public around. And that's where if we see, and I'll close with this, I'm glad you brought up his iconic phrase, tear down this wall. And the second most iconic phrase people most often associate with him is calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. And Ken was reading from that speech. And those are wonderful turns of phrase, but they contain multitudes. They're not just punchy lines of the campaign trail. These are brilliant strategic insights. And if you read all of his foreign policy speeches in sequence, and I did in the course of working on the book, so you don't have to, right? But if you do, you'll see that it's a sustained, sophisticated argument he's making about the illegitimacy and evil and malignancy of communism and the virtues and the superiority of the free world. And I keep on talking about the free world because it wasn't only just about the United States for him, it's about the United States and our allies and keeping faith with them as well.
KT, you've worked under 4 Republican administrations over the course of your career. I wonder what you think President Reagan learned from his Republican predecessors and what his successors learned from Reagan.
That's a great question. I think that the interesting thing about Reagan is because he wasn't a Pol, he wasn't from the Washington think tank world, because he hadn't been in Congress, that he was able to, because he'd been a businessman and a labor leader and a Hollywood actor, he was able to look at the wholeness of American foreign policy and understand that the economic weapon was our ace in the hole. And when Bill just said, at the time, in the late 1970s, the thought was that the Soviet Union was going to be forever, it had a strong economy. I mean, Nobel laureate John Kenneth Galbraith said in 1979 that the Soviet economy was far superior to the American economy, yada, yada, yada. And that was the prevalent view at the time, that the Soviet Union was so strong because it had a full employment economy, it had a planned central economy, and it was going to be, really do better than sometimes the United States did, especially the United States in the late 1970s, which had stagflation, our economic crises. The genius of Reagan was he understood the Soviet Union had only one thing they sold to the world, which was oil and natural gas, maybe some weapons, but oil and natural gas, and that they needed high energy prices to pay for their government. It paid for everything else because, nobody bought who bought Russian cars, right? Nobody. And so Reagan understood that if you could take away their income, you could bankrupt them. And ultimately, we won the Cold War. The good speeches, all the other things, but because we bankrupted the Soviet Union. And here's how it happened. there was a man that he was the number 2 guy at the CIA, General Vernon Walters, really tall guy, and he was a friend of the King of Saudi Arabia. So General Vernon Walters was dispatched to go to the desert, talk to the king, and say, would you please pump more oil? It's not in your economic interest to pump more oil because the price of oil will go down, but you will get the eternal friendship of the United States if you do. So the Saudis pumped more oil, and the price of oil went from $40 to $18 a barrel in 9 months, and it cut the Soviet Union's revenue stream in half, because something like 80% of the budget of what really made the Soviet Union work was oil exports. And so by cutting their budget in half, with all the other things that Reagan had set up, with the technology, with the United States military buildup, with Star Wars, with our allies, with shutting out the Soviet Union access to the world banking system, that was the crunch. And so when you look at what happened before Reagan, people didn't really understand the economic argument. Maybe FDR did with Lend-Lease in World War II. But nobody really thought about it because, they think tank guys, government guys, who just, increase the deficit, more spending. But Reagan understood that you could bankrupt your adversary and you win, not by going to war. So that was how you win the Cold War without firing a shot. Now, what is the legacy going forward? I don't want to get into a Donald Trump argument here, but there is a certain sense that by having energy prices be at $40 a barrel, which they were at the end of the Trump administration, and they're now about $100 a barrel, that what that extra money has done to our adversaries is give them a bankroll again to use, in the case of Russia, to invade Ukraine, and in the case of Iran, to go there. But I think that the lasting legacy of Reagan should be that use the economic weapon. That's what we're really good at.
So, Ambassador, you mentioned the importance of alliances in Reagan's mind, and there's iconic photos of him huddling with certain world leaders, and we have Thatcher family represented here, we have the Mulroney family represented here, you mentioned Helmut Kohl, you also mentioned the Pope, which I think a lot of people know something about, but others may not know how close that relationship was, or at least how strategic that relationship was. I wonder if you could just give us a few more insights into his personal relationship and how much that mattered with some of those other world figures.
Absolutely. Ronald Reagan's relationship with the Pope was grounded certainly in the importance of the human spirit in terms of freedom. And even to your last question, it relates to the Pope. I think what really distinguished Ronald Reagan and where he and the Pope really joined forces was this anti-communism. The Pope knew what Poland had undergone and wanted to see Poland free again, to be able to have its independence. Reagan, from his days in Hollywood and when he was involved in labor, he writes about it, about how he saw forces that he did not like. And when he came into the White House, he was very committed to democracy and human freedom. And I would say it was very important, this kind of moral clarity, this battle of ideas, because we were in the midst of the Cold War. Remember that? And you're either on one side, as he called it, the evil empire, you're on the other side. And he felt very strongly, well, so did the Pope. It was grounded in religion, in values, in terms of the importance of human dignity, and they really joined forces. There was such a camaraderie that was very significant. And I think guided the relationship for both men in different ways. If I may also add, on Poland, the Pope's own thinking, his own involvement and inspiration, and the hope that he had provided for the Polish people and for Solidarność at the time was crucial to Reagan. And this is where they joined forces. Let me also mention, and let's not forget, the Reagan Doctrine. I mentioned it earlier, but the Reagan Doctrine was absolutely crucial. Crucial in terms of comparing him to what was before and also after Why? Because it's the Reagan doctrine that actually did speak about providing assistance to those kinds of resistance movements that wanted to have their own human and fundamental freedoms. And so in this sense, the foundation, the values, that foundation of values is what really drew both the President Reagan, and the Pope very, very much together. I have one last footnote here, and that is, I think that what's important here too, to remind ourselves about Reagan, and there's something, Ann Compton, you asked about, well, what is it that really we could do? Reagan had not only statements that are enduring, like peace through strength. We hear that to this very day. There are many policymakers who use it over and over. And in a way, the very essence of the administration is enduring and what inspires people. We can remind people of those ideas and reiterate them, and particularly for younger generations. I'm very proud to, by the way, be a professor in the Academy, the Civic Education and Democracy Academy, under the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. And why this is important, because these very values and what Reagan said has to be enduring for that next generation. And that's a place and a space in which that can be advanced through education and the importance of such critical programs that have been launched, and of which, Fred Ryan, you are spearheading, and David here, your education team is also advancing.
Can I just jump in? What she just said is really important about the power of ideas. And you mentioned it in passing when you first started talking, Paul, about what Reagan said to the Polish workers. This is an important story that absolutely is not going to be in anybody's library, right? You're not going to ever see it here unless David gets really smart and puts it here. Reagan gave a speech to the AFL-CIO in March 30th, 1981. And Reagan personally put a paragraph in that speech. And Reagan was saying, I was a member of a Screen Actors Guild, and I'm a labor union guy like you. I totally, we get it. But he wrote a paragraph in that speech where he said to the Polish people, he said, you have the right to protest, you have the right to an equal wage, you have the same rights as all men and women around the world. It was an impassioned 2 paragraphs about the right of the Polish workers. No American president had said anything about this, ever. The only person who had spoken on the international stage was the Pope. Reagan said those two paragraphs, and nobody paid attention, because half an hour later, Reagan was shot. So the whole news cycle was all about the Reagan assassination attempt, and nobody heard it except the Polish workers and Lech Walesa and Solidarity. They remembered that Reagan had said, we're with you, we are one with you. And that power, that idea, as you've just talked about, made all the difference.
Also, I will just add, if I may, no, I do have my mic. Thank you.
They've turned mine off.
But thank you. I was going to say that the others who do remember, and it was significant for Reagan, again in terms of his relationships with some who you might not ordinarily think he would have paired up with, or they paired up with him, Lane Kirkland of the AFL-CIO, who adored what Reagan was doing in Poland. And these forces, these multiple forces, those who we were aligned with, then of course the Pope, and then the AFL-CIO, it was very significant, and it certainly did lay a foundation for showing him as a very effective leader, practitioner, policymaker. And I have just one fast, and that is, I do want to mention Jeane Kirkpatrick, because President Reagan brought in Jeane Kirkpatrick. And why I want to mention Jeane Kirkpatrick to all of you is, you know what he loved about her? She talked about, I want to take off the kick me sign for America. She said, we have to stand up for America. We're exceptional. And he was a proud American. And that other point about Ronald Reagan's 10-year leadership, I think, is an important aspect to remember.
Professor, on the theme of resisting communism, today's fight of course, is not against the Soviets. It is and will be against the Chinese Communist Party. I wonder how you feel about Reagan's experience when it came to the CCP in his day in the 80s, and how some of the lessons of his foreign policy should be applied today as we stare down this next evil empire, if you will.
Yeah, sure. And I want to pick up on that guy, but also with a bridge from the really important points that KT and Paula were making about Reagan's support for Voices for Freedom, and this will come back to China in a second. So political and religious dissidents, especially behind the Iron Curtain, particularly within the Soviet Union, saw Reagan as their champion. They didn't have voices, and so he became a voice to the voiceless for them. And one of my favorite vignettes about the evil empire speech, which was, of course, is derided and mocked by respectable opinion and the elite media at the time that he gave it. But a few weeks after he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, word makes its way through Pravda and through smuggled newspapers to a prison cell in the Soviet Gulag, and that's where the famous Jewish dissident Natan Sharansky was serving a 6 or 7 year sentence. And Sharansky says that when he learned that the American president had called his government an evil empire, he was overjoyed, and he felt more hope than he'd felt in years in prison. And he tapped out in their primitive prison Morse code, signal to his the joining cell, telling them, the American president called our leaders an evil empire. And he said shouts of joy start erupting throughout the prison, right? And so they finally felt someone knows our plight, someone is willing to speak with moral clarity and the truth about this evil regime under us. One of my favorite exhibits in the museum, I've gone through the museum here dozens of times, but you always learn something new. One of my favorite exhibits is the human rights exhibit profiling a number of the prisoners of conscience. It includes this wonderful kind of 1/4 inch by 1 inch scrap of paper on which 11 imprisoned Soviet women dissidents, led by the poet Irina Ratushinskaya, had written a congratulations note to Reagan on his re-election in 1984, and it's essentially saying, you are our champion, you are giving us hope for freedom. And it was smuggled out for, took a few months to get it smuggled out to him. And Reagan was very touched and moved by this, but it also let him know that even if editorial pages of the United States were disparaging his harsh rhetoric, that the freedom fighters, the Voices for Freedom, the courageous dissidents behind the Iron Curtain were being encouraged by it and emboldened by it. And they were part of his strategy to put internal pressure on the Soviet system. So what's this mean for China today? To step back, part of Reagan's strategic genius in the Cold War was most previous presidents had primarily located the Cold War within Europe. And, Europe was the epicenter for it, especially in a divided Germany. Nixon, I had, earlier said that Nixon, I think, had the détente framework wrong, but Nixon got something right, which was trying to bring China more into the American orbit to bring pressure against the Soviets in the East. And that was a part of expanding the chessboard. Reagan took it further. Reagan truly globalized the Cold War. He thought, all right, if we're going to isolate the Soviet Union, we want them to feel pressure on all their sides. And so he brought Japan in as a very important strategic partner for the United States as part of an overall strategic revolution that he did in Asia. Sure, Japan had been our ally before into the 1970s, but they were primarily an economic rival. And Reagan, by managing the trade tensions, standing firm for free markets, not getting into a protectionist trade war, transforms the U.S.-Japan relationship from primarily economic rivalry to primarily a strategic partner. Japan tripled its defense spending under Reagan to bring a lot more pressure on the Soviets in the Soviet Far East. Okay? And then Reagan supports democracy, transitions to democracy in Taiwan and South Korea. He is very firm on supporting Taiwan, especially on their military and defense needs against possible aggression from China. And so he's very sophisticated in how he managed the relationship with China, keeps him helping put pressure on the Soviets, but he also is not going to give them carte blanche to make an aggressive move against Taiwan. Because ultimately for Reagan, our most important allies in Asia were the democracies, and he wanted more of the democracies and saw them as part of this battle of ideas against the Soviet Union. And that's what's missing today in our contest with China. I think the United States, and I'm very hawkish on China, and I supported a lot of President Trump's hard policies on China. I think President Biden has done a reasonably good job with China as well, certainly compared to other aspects of his foreign policy. But what they both have
low
been missing is still treating it as primarily an economic challenge and a security challenge, and not seeing that it's a battle of ideas as well, right? And there are plenty of religious dissidents, imprisoned pastors, imprisoned priests, political dissidents in China who are not feeling that support from the United States right now, who don't, who want a free government for themselves, who hate the oppression they're getting out of the Chinese Communist Party, right? When Xi Jinping puts his head on his pillow at night, his main worry, what's keep him up, is not so much his fear of the United States, it's his fear of his own people, right? That's why he spends untold billions of dollars investing in the most pervasive, massive surveillance state in human history, can control and monitor every thought that his people are thinking, right? But we, as the freest nation in human history, that's an advantage for us. Why aren't we doing more to exploit that? Why aren't we giving him more sleepless nights being afraid of his own people, knowing that the United States is supporting them in their aspirations for freedom?
Ken, you mentioned you have all sorts of great Reagan stories through the years. Is there one personal story that you have, an anecdote about him that you think exemplifies who he was as a person and what his legacy means?
Well, I think what his legacy really started on the first words he gave as president. It was a terribly exciting day on January 20th, 1981. For the inauguration. Rick Burt and I and others had been involved in the preparation for it. I got buttons for my jacket that I still wear and have transferred all the time. And I was terribly excited about the inauguration. My parents flew in from Chicago, a brother flew in from North Carolina, a sister flew in from California. We decided to do a black tie dinner that night, and so we had the Cheneys over for dinner, we had the Rumsfelds over, the Carlucci's, and Gene Kirkpatrick, and had the dinner there. And at 4 o'clock, while we're setting the table, I got a call that the hostages had been released a half hour after Reagan took office. Carter had called in the afternoon for Reagan to see if he could use a plane to go over to Wiesbaden for the hostages, and the Reagan team wanted somebody to go with them, so they asked me to go. And I'll tell you, one of the coolest things in my life was to leave my own black tie dinner that night with all these people in our little house in Arlington and go off to Wiesbaden. That was a really cool thing. But what Reagan really exemplified for me on that exciting day was, and Ann Compton started to read it, but it's really quite remarkable, his first words as president, okay? And I know, KT, you don't want to get into the Trump stuff, and all my shouters out there should get ready because I'm going to go into the Trump stuff, so get ready to shout me down. Yeah. I'm quoting Reagan, so you can boo Reagan. Reagan's first words as president. You may not like it, okay? This is Reagan's first words as president of the United States. And I hope I don't break up on this. To a few of us here today, this is a solemn and most momentous occasion. And yet in the history of our nation, it is a commonplace occurrence. The orderly transfer of authority, as called for in the Constitution, routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries. And few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle. Well, now we realize that we can't just assume that there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power. Okay, if you're against a peaceful transfer of power, I understand. But you know, that's not the Reagan legacy. Shame on me to read Ronald Reagan's first words as president. I mean, Okay, Reagan, You don't think anything happened on January 6th? Was
So,
okay,
folks, all right.
Okay. I read Ronald Reagan's first words as president.
And I think they speak for themselves, and I think that they are powerful words, and I'm glad that you did. We only have about 6 minutes left.
Okay.
So one of my colleagues who
all the shouters can sit back now.
So my colleague, Brett Baer,
Yeah.
I've had the privilege of serving on his panel on Special Report fairly regularly. And when I'm really lucky, I'm sitting in the place where Dr. Krauthammer used to sit.
Yeah.
Krauthammer, I will point out, was a Mondale speechwriter in his younger days. And he came around, I think it's fair to say. And so that is one of the highlights so far of my career, being on that panel. And sometimes when it's a very busy news day and there's all sorts of hell breaking loose, and he knows that the whole panel is loaded for bear, he won't even ask a question. He will just say your name, and you can just go wherever you want, which I always appreciate. So in the 6 minutes that we have left, I know there's probably a few pent-up things that each of you has to say. If we can keep it brief, if possible. Professor.
All right, we've talked before about Reagan's humor and also framing the Cold War as a battle of ideas, so I'll just close with two of my favorite Reagan jokes, all right, both of which are delivering an important point here. First one, Reagan says, this is to illustrate freedom of speech, right? He says, so I'm talking to Chairman Brezhnev, and I'm trying to explain to Chairman Brezhnev what it means to have free speech in the United States. I said, Chairman Brezhnev, in the United States, someone can stand on Pennsylvania Avenue right in front of the White House with a bullhorn and scream at the top of their lungs, Ronald Reagan is a bum and a no-good president. And Reagan says, and it's fine, nothing will happen to him, he's not going to be arrested. And Brezhnev says, oh, Mr. President, you don't understand, we have the same freedom in the Soviet Union. Reagan says, what? And Brezhnev says, sure, someone can stand in the middle of Red Square with a bullhorn and yell the same thing. All right, okay. All right, the second joke, all right, and this one is with apologies to the previous panel, which had a couple of wonderful economists on it. Reagan also liked to tell this one about the challenges of a managed economy, a command economy. Brezhnev is presiding over one of those iconic military parades in Red Square, right? And he's got a foreign visitor there, a European head of state with him. And the T-72 tanks roll by, and the MiG-25 fighter jets fly it over, and then the goose-stepping Red Army goes by, and the armored personnel carriers, and it's an incredible display of Soviet military might. And then finally, the SS-18 missiles come rolling by too, right? The largest ICBMs in the world. And then at the end of the parade, a kind of beaten down old bus comes along and stops in front of the reviewing stand, and out of the bus step out a bunch of people like me, actually, a bunch of professors, right? And they're kind of, they've got the suede patches sewed on their sport coats and the scraggly beards and the slide rules, that kind of stuff. And the foreign visitor turns to Brezhnev and says, who are they and what are they doing in this parade? And Brezhnev says, oh, that is a bus full of economists. You have no idea how much damage they can cause.
Ken.
I just want to give my shouters out there just some last thing to think about that we're talking about, and we're here. It's the lasting, the enduring legacy of Ronald Reagan. And I think when you go through the library, and they do a wonderful, wonderful exhibit, and you talk about Reagan's legacy, and people talk about his decency, and they talk about his values, and they talk about the peaceful transfer of power, and they talk about how he loved the military, and we're going to see that tomorrow. And we now have to me, a Republican Party that is just very, very far away from the Reagan legacy. So my last point should be, and you can beat me up afterwards, and listen, I can do a million Reagan stories, and I've done it here when the library was open, and I had a lot of fun. But that's not the subject of our conference here, and this is an important moment, okay? The Republicans are about to nominate for the third time. I don't know any Republican that's been nominated third time of the party, but the Republicans are about to nominate for the third time somebody who I think, my opinion, is has nothing to do with the Reagan legacy. And I'll leave you with one last story. We were very close to the Cheneys starting in 1970. We worked with them. And Liz Cheney was Carol's special assistant for 3 years. And, Liz Cheney said at one point when they were talking about establishing the January 6th committee, and Kevin McCarthy said, we just don't want to do that, and he gave all kinds of reason. And in his office, he had a big picture of Ronald Reagan, and he just wanted to shut everything down. And Liz Cheney said, that's nothing that Ronald Reagan would do. That's nothing that my father would do. And Kevin McCarthy says one of the honest things he ever said, it's not their party anymore. You have to understand that, Liz. And I believe that. I don't believe that it's Reagan's party anymore. And it grieves me a lot.
We're up against the clock. KT.
That's it.
There was a Republican
You need
primary debate.
You need this.
Oops, gotta have the mic. Okay, there was a Republican primary debate. I don't know if it was the one here, but anyway, it was for 2016. And to show you how beloved Ronald Reagan remains, there were about I covered it for Fox News, and there were about 6 of the candidates who were on the stage, and each one of them kind of made their way over to me at one point or another and said, so Marco Rubio says, I know you used to work for Reagan. Don't you think I'm Reagan's heir? And then Rand Paul came over to me, and he said, well, I know you wrote the Weinberger Principles of War. Don't you think I really am Ronald Reagan's heir? Yeah. And then, anyway, ad seriatim, each one of them came up. They were all very different personalities, very different sort of messages they wanted to make. But the amazing, enduring thing of Ronald Reagan is that every single one of them is convinced that he's Ronald Reagan's heir.
Last but not least, Ambassador.
One quick point just on something Will said, because I think you'd be interested. He mentioned Anatoly Sharansky, now Nathan Sharansky. By the way, what I wanted to add, he had the opportunity to meet President Reagan in the Oval Office. He was released from the Soviet Gulag, and he actually told Reagan directly, your words, your speeches inspired me and gave me hope. It gave me hope to go on. And I really wanted to connect that because he was released. He became Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, by the way. I will tell a personal story which has humor in it. So when I was working on the White House National Security Council, and the National Security Advisor at the time was, many of you Californians would know this name, Judge William Clark, who was the National Security Advisor. He would bring NSC staffers into the Oval Office. So I got the call early in the morning, and it was Judge Clark saying, Paula, I want you to come and join me today to brief President Reagan on Poland. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, okay, I'm going into the Oval Office in the morning, we're gonna talk about Poland. So I get into the Oval Office, and you have the names you're familiar with. You had me, Baker, Deaver, they were there, as well as the Vice President, George H.W. Bush. So the president comes in, and he goes, good morning, everyone. You know who was with me yesterday? Was Miss America. And you know something? We had a great meeting. She gave me something that I want to show all of you. So all of us are wondering, what is it? What is it? He says, look, she gave me this business card. I'm going to use it. See, it says, I'm Mr. Everything. Isn't that great? And he said, but you know, there was a little problem. And you know what that is? I flipped it over, and it has all these qualifications, but it doesn't have 3 things that I know that I am: sensual, sexy, and foxy. So he definitely knew how to use humor.
And on that wonderful note.
And my briefing went swimmingly after that.
Panel, thank you so much, and we'll see you at dinner in just a moment.
Well done.